Welcome to the Project Censored show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today in this segment, we are delighted to welcome back to the program Shealeigh Voitl and Steve Macek, who work with us at Project Censored. Today, we're going to be discussing a contribution that they made to the recent book that we have out from Censored Press and Seven Stories Press. It's Project Censored State of the Free Press 2023. One of the chapters we do every year, and Steve and Shealeigh, our guests, whom I'll properly introduce in a moment, have been contributing to, is a chapter called Deja Vu News. Project Censored years ago through Carl Jensen and Peter Phillips, our previous directors. They thought that the annual reporting about underreported and censored stories needed a follow-up component to show the depth and the cultural significance, sort of the architecture, if you will, of censorship and the history of it. And the project goes back to 1976. So there's a pretty rich background of the kinds of stories, not just specific stories, but the kinds of stories and the patterns of stories that happen to be censored. And each year, the Deja Vu Research project, part of this, goes back and looks at previous year's stories, and it does an update on them. In other words, it goes back and says, well, what happened to this story from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that may still be quite relevant today? Was it picked up by the establishment press? Did the corporate media get around to covering that story? Or does it continue to languish in obscurity? Right. And it's an important exercise for several reasons. And I mean, the historian part of me, has an obvious interest in this. The journalist part of me has another, and that's that we can continue to improve upon the way our so-called free press operates by reminding people in the establishment press that there are plenty of things to cover other than the Kardashians or, the latest tripe scandal, what have you. So with us today, we have Shealeigh Voitl, who graduated from North Central College outside of Chicago, 2021. She was co-author of the Deja Vu chapter in the last two Project Censored volumes. Shealeigh is a freelance journalist. She was our Project Censored research associate, but now is our editorial assistant. Shealeigh Voitl, welcome back to the Project Censored show.
Thank you for having me.
It's a delight. Steve Macek, always great to talk to you, professor of communication at North Central College outside Chicago. That's in Naperville, Illinois. You've been a frequent contributor to the project for years, delightfully so. And your op-eds and articles on media and politics and First Amendment have been published in Truth Out, Common Dreams, Z Magazine, Ms. Magazine, assorted other newspapers and online publications. And you recently have a piece with our associate director, Andy Lee Roth, at Truth Out. Steve Macek, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me, Andy. And it's always a pleasure to be on also with Shealeigh, my former student.
Yes, and I'm Mickey. Andy's not with us.
But sorry. My gosh, Andy.
But I'll take that. You're going to see Andy in a little bit.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're good. No, we're totally good. But anyway, Deja Vu News, you all did something that I love, that this is part of the research thread from this year. And you really looked at a particular pattern and thread through a specific theme. And again, the subtitle here is Deja Vu News, Eating and Drinking, Birthing and Breastfeeding, a look back at establishment media's failure to report corporate interference with basic human biology. So Steve Macek, let's start with you. Give us a quick background on how you've been conducting the Deja Vu research with us. And you might even want to kick us off with one of the specific stories, and then we're going to talk to Shealeigh.
I certainly will, Mickey. And yeah, sorry for calling you Andy again.
No, you're
yeah. So normally when we do the research for the Deja Vu chapter, we just take stories that have been from like 5 or 6 years ago, interesting stories that we think have had interesting new developments or have all of a sudden made their way onto the national news agenda, and then we delve deep into those. This year, it's somewhat different because we chose a collection of stories from as far back as 20 years ago that all have to do with the way that corporations and their profit-seeking activities interfere with kind of human biology, with human metabolism, with nature. And so, among the stories that we looked at were stories that had to do with corporate interference with corporate pollution of the environment, with release of microplastics and toxic chemicals into the environment, stories that had to do with corporations' efforts to privatize water, and the growing corporate control, oligopolistic or cartel control over the world's food supply and agriculture, as well as stories that had to do with that kind of corporate interference with breastfeeding and birthing. And I know Shealeigh is going to talk about some of those stories, but one that I'd like to highlight is the story that has to do with corporations seeking to privatize water. So this story first was listed on Project Censored's top 25 list of underreported stories back in 2001. And it had to do with the World Bank and multinational corporations, and in particular Bechtel, pushing countries in the developing world and the global South to privatize their water systems. Now, as you know, right, across the global South, there are lots of countries that are highly indebted. They don't have a lot in the way of sort of public resources or public assets that they can use to pay off those debts. And in Bolivia, the Bechtel Corporation, kind of pressed the government to privatize the water. It provoked a huge public outcry and a backlash, and years and years of protest that took place. And we wanted to go back and look at this. And one of the things that we found was, so one of the things that Bechtel did, this private corporation that claimed to have ownership over the water of of the Bolivian country, is it sued the Bolivian government for basically reneging on a deal to privatize their water system. This led to international outcry against this corporation, protests that took place out in front of their headquarters in San Francisco and in other places, and the lawsuit, which started back in the early 2000s, dragged out and was not finally resolved until January of 2006, when Bechtel agreed to settle for a symbolic payment of damages of 30 cents. So it dragged out for like 6 years after this story was first put on the Project Censored top 25 list. Now, one of the things that we found out in looking at this, and looking back at this story, is, yes, some of the protests that took place about Bechtel's behavior, about the push to privatize water in Bolivia, did get some corporate news coverage. After, as the case wore on. But what was really striking is, private corporations have been replicating this kind of behavior all over the world, pushing governments to privatize their water utilities, not to improve service for their citizens, because in most cases, when the water supply is privatized and control over water is privatized, or water treatment is privatized, it results in poor service, right?
Yeah,
for
like
citizens.
Here in Stockton, like in California,
right, like in Stockton. But in order to cash in, so in order for private corporations to cash in and make money, and so in the chapter, in the Deja Vu section, we detail a number of these struggles that have taken place, from Pittsburgh to other municipalities in the U.S. over privatization of water. And a lot of those struggles have not gotten, and Baltimore and other cities in the U.S., a lot of those struggles have not gotten adequate coverage by the corporate media, and have been more covered in more depth by the independent and alternative media.
And that's right. And that's the voice of Dr. Steve Macek, professor of communications, North Central College, contributor to the Deja Vu chapter in Project Censored's annual book. And we're going to turn here to Shealeigh Voitl to talk about another one of these stories. And Steve, and we're going to stick on the water theme here. We're going to talk about microplastics and toxic chemicals increasingly prevalent in the world's oceans, if we could do that. But Steve, really quickly, just to follow up before we shift over to Shealeigh, this is these corporations too that are trying to privatize water, whether it's Nestle or others. They've gone after journalists that try to report these stories. Abby Martin comes to mind, right? Abby Martin and the Empire Files, her work that she did on Breaking the Set. So there's multiple layers to this story that the legacy press should and could be covering,
Right.
and they just tend not to.
And let me just say that the independent media are really the alarm system for the public and drawing the public's attention to these things. So one just detail I want to make reference to, because I didn't refer to it before, out of the update of this story about privatization of water, is that in Joe Biden's infrastructure bill, he had originally included a provision that would have made it possible to create public-private partnerships that would have created sort of a loophole that would make it easier for cities and states to privatize their water supply. And it really was first reporting by independent journalists who drew attention to that. Now, that did eventually become a story that got picked up by the Washington Post and the New York Times. I mean, they did write about that, but it was the independent and alternative journalists who sounded the alarm that there was this provision in this infrastructure bill that would have, made it easier to privatize water systems.
Indeed. And Steve Macek, it's often the independent press that are the canaries in the coal mine that midwife these stories into the establishment. We're foreshadowing here what we'll be talking about later when we get into cesarean sections and breastfeeding and some other topics that you all addressed in the chapter. But before we do that, Shealeigh Voitl, you want to talk to us about microplastics and the world's oceans. This is an important Deja Vu story, and we've been covering that for some time. Shealeigh.
Yeah, so that was the number 5 story in last year's State of the Free Press, the threat of microplastics to the world's oceans and the global seafood supply. And since then, the corporate press has followed up on more recent research about microplastics, but they paid little attention to that original story that was published in Medical News Today in 2020, which was based on a study about these toxic chemicals known as PFAs and microplastics.
Forever chemicals are also
That's
referred
right.
to, right?
That's right. Found in seafood sold in Australian markets. And Truth Out also reported in 2020 that these forever chemicals, this exposure, increased a person's risk of certain cancers, could cause liver damage, thyroid problems, and also someone with elevated levels of chemicals in their system would also be twice as likely to develop a severe form of COVID. So in September 2020, it was like over 70 countries signed a voluntary pledge in an attempt to, among other things, stop plastic from entering the ocean by 2050. But, notably, the
Better
United
late
States,
than never.
You're right. Didn't sign. United States didn't sign. Brazil didn't sign. India, Australia, China, Russia, they didn't agree to the pledge. But days after the State of the Free Press 2022 was published, a new study revealed that microplastics caused damage to human cells in the laboratory at levels known to be eaten by people via their food. And then by spring, there was a new discovery of microplastics detected in human blood. And that was in Environmental International. There was another study that revealed that microplastics were discovered in 11 of 13 lung tissue samples taken from patients undergoing surgery. Shocking. And so in March of last year, 175 countries, with the support of the United Nations Environmental Assembly, they agreed to develop a global treaty to limit plastic waste, which will be hopefully finalized next year. And I mean, obviously, it's great that, this story is getting more traction. Microplastics are getting more traction in the mainstream news. It's been covered by USA Today, Fortune, Bloomberg, NBC. But I think, what's really important to note about this story is that, our addiction to plastic as a society is so harmful, so dangerous. And I don't think that the corporate media pays as much attention consistently to that issue in particular as they maybe should.
Indeed. And Shealeigh Voitl, you write in in the Deja Vu chapter that for initiatives like the UN Treaty on Plastic Waste to be successful, the media will have to do a much better job of informing the public about the health and environmental crisis being created by our addiction to plastic. You just said that. And it warrants repetition.
Yeah.
Because there's plenty of repetition in our media about a lot of things that we don't either need to know or care about. And these kind of stories, especially the deja vu stories, deja vu all over again, these stories aren't necessarily new. And what you're showing us and reminding us is that these aren't going away. And unless we are better informed about what's happening, we cannot mobilize and engage civically to make significant differences. And so the media
absolutely
plays a key role, Shealeigh. The media plays
I mean, I think the corporate press struggles to cover problems that require long-term solutions. And, when many of them, many of these stories are environment related, the progress is slow moving. And, there's not that time that's devoted to properly and fully cover these large scale societal problems that require, systemic change. And I think the mistake is thinking that readers will get bored of this kind of news when the implications are so dire, So I think that's why this chapter is like so important, to remind people that we're still thinking about these stories, even if the corporate press isn't covering them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the voice of Shealeigh Voitl, editorial assistant with us at the project, also co-author of Deja Vu News. We're also speaking with Dr. Steve Macek. He's also co-author and researcher on the Deja Vu News project with us here at Project Censored. I'm Mickey Huff, the host of the Project Censored show. We are going to continue our conversation with Shealeigh Voitl and Steve Macek after this brief musical break. Please stay with us. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Project Censored show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today in this segment, we are delighted to be speaking with researchers and authors Steve Macek and Shealeigh Voitl, co-authors of the Deja Vu News chapter and our annual work. You can find our work available for free online at projectcensored.org, including a lot of the stories that are being referenced today. Just very quickly, the theme of today's conversation relating to this publication, Eating and Drinking, Birthing and Breastfeeding, a look back at the establishment media's failure to report corporate interference with basic human biology. The first segment we heard from Steve Macek talking about global implications of water privatization. We just heard from Shealeigh Voitl on the ongoing challenges of microplastics in the ocean that are now in our human bodies through food supply. And, Shealeigh, let's continue with you. Again, a reminder, Shealeigh Voitl graduated from North Central College, co-author of the Deja Vu chapter for Project Censored the last 2 years, now our editorial assistant, my apologies. And also Steve Macek, professor of communications at North Central College, frequent contributor to the project. Steve, we're going to come back to you to talk about more here in a moment, but
absolutely,
we want to riff with Shealeigh. We want to kind of go from the plastics and the water. We want to go to the issues about birthing, breastfeeding, and Shealeigh, I know you have some things that you want to say about this based on your research.
Yeah, so there was a story that was originally in Censored 2001. It was about a Guatemalan law that was designed to better inform new mothers of the benefits of breastfeeding and, some of the risks associated with breast milk substitutes. So, for example, Gerber and other formula manufacturers were prohibited from marketing to mothers in hospitals, from sending out free samples of their products. And they also said, hey, you can't have that cute little chubby baby on your packaging anymore. And, Gerber was like, absolutely not. And they fought it before a World Trade Organization tribunal and won. And a lot has happened since then. Corporate greed. The project knows those stories so well, but probably the significant update was that in 2018, the UN wanted to discuss a resolution that would prevent these, erroneous marketing claims in formula products, basically knocking out anything that suggested that their products were more nutritious than breast milk. And this was a big upset for U.S. formula giants Abbott and Mead Johnson. And so the United States said, you have to remove the passage from this resolution about protecting, promoting, and supporting breastfeeding. And the U.S. even threatened to impose tariffs and withdraw military aid from Ecuador, who was set to introduce this resolution if they went ahead without the US's sort of suggested edits. And then this led to, of course, a Twitter tirade from Trump, who called, the New York Times coverage of the UN resolution fake news. And he said that he supported breastfeeding, but that formula was essential for women living in poverty, who had babies that were at risk of malnutrition. And while, there are many reasons that a parent might choose to feed their baby formula, it might be medical, it might be personal choice or circumstance. But what we know is that formula is the more costly option, and breast milk contains nutrients that can't be found in any formula.
There you go. That's what I was waiting for.
Right. And so, no one was suggesting that formula shouldn't be an option for parents, just that formula manufacturers' marketing is misleading. And at any rate, the resolution was ultimately introduced by Russia, and it passed without any of the US's edits. And the corporate media have sort of steadily covered breastfeeding news in the US, since, this story was covered by Project Censored in 2001. But they haven't really examined the implications of these formula manufacturers' sort of predatory marketing in, low-income countries.
Absolutely. Shealeigh Voitl and Steve Macek, let's go to you and connect the thread there, and then we'll come back to Shealeigh for another example.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about the update that we included in this year's chapter about the cesarean section epidemic. So
before we do that,
yeah, sure.
Before we do that, let's connect this other dot. I'm thinking about formula and global food cartels, right?
Sure.
Because global food cartels are fast becoming the world's supermarket. And again, this is kind of a promotional thing, right? There's a big ad campaign. There's a lot of control over this. And then, of course, we're going to come back and do cesarean sections, and you and Shealeigh can both talk about that for sure.
Sure. Okay. So the story that we updated concerning the global food cartel was the number 19 story back in 2005.
A while ago.
And yeah, so it's close to 20 years ago. There was an article in a magazine that's now defunct, Left Turn, that noted that a shrinking number of large conglomerates control the majority of the world's food production and food distribution. As the news about like inflation and the soaring cost of eggs recently has underscored, this is not a problem that's gone away. In fact, in the interim, in the past, 2 decades or so since this story was put on Project Censored's top 25 list, the problem has only gotten worse. So as we note in the update, a number of giant conglomerates, for example, Dow and DuPont, Bayer and Monsanto, who are manufacturers of fertilizers, pesticides, and also produce a lot of seeds that are used in commercial agriculture, have merged with each other. And we've seen like this just, dramatic increase in consolidation over what you could call the agricultural inputs for, big kind of commercial agriculture. So, for example, recent reports suggest that just 3 companies control 83% of U.S. corn seed sales. Just 3 companies. 70% of the global pesticide market is controlled by just 3 companies. But the problem doesn't just end with these sorts of inputs. It also has to do with with egg production, meat production of various kinds. One of the reports that we make reference to in this chapter notes that between 1970 and 2015, the number of independent egg producers of farms that produce eggs shrank from 10,000 companies in 1970 to 200 in 2015. And that actually makes our food supply a lot more vulnerable, as we point out in the update, because when you have fewer large, egg producers, usually these huge farms with, all of these big coops, they're much more susceptible to outbreaks of avian flu, which is actually what has just happened recently. Is one of the reasons why egg prices have been soaring, is that there are fewer and fewer egg producers. So if one giant farm is hit with an outbreak of avian flu, it shuts down, a major portion of the egg supply. Not only that, but the distribution end of our food supply has also become increasingly consolidated in the hands of a very few companies. And I'll just say that we make reference to a 2021 joint investigation that was conducted by The Guardian and the Food and Water Watch into the illusion of choice that defines the American grocery industry. What they did is they went through and looked at all of the items on grocery store shelves, and they found that most of those items are produced by just a very few companies. So it was a study of more than 60 categories of everyday food items, found that despite a variety of lines and labels, nearly 80% were sold by 4 or fewer mega firms.
Well, Steve, that's same as media. There's 6 major companies, big tech, 4. It's the pattern across the spectrum.
It is a pattern across the sector. It's the same as our medical supplies, right? The same as big pharma, same as our financial institutions. The same thing is happening in banking, but it's especially alarming when what we're talking about is our food. And largely this has gone unreported in the corporate media, except as a business story. So obviously the Wall Street Journal and the business pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post, will report in detail about these mergers, the merger between Bayer and Monsanto.
The investors got to know,
because that matters to the investors. When in fact it should be front page news.
Public interest.
That a shrinking number of companies control the supply of food, and a shrinking number of companies control its distribution and sale. That should be front page news, but it's not.
Absolutely, Steve Macek. And Steve, you alluded to the other story that we were going to get to here, and I want to go back to Shealeigh Voitl to kick us off, and then we'll come back to you for some final thoughts, Steve. Shealeigh Voitl, one of the other stories that you went back and looked at goes back to the mid-1990s, Public Citizen. One of the many things Ralph Nader's had hands in over the years. These organizations, institutions. You researched cesarean sections epidemic. Can you talk about that, Shealeigh?
You know what? I will throw it over to Steve. I know he was.
Oh, okay. So don't
eager
feel the
to talk
thunder.
about
Steve was excited to talk about it. Okay,
I was excited. I was thrilled. I'm thrilled and excited to talk about this story. Okay, so
go ahead.
This is the oldest of the stories on the list. As you said, it was a Public Citizen report that was released in 1994, and it revealed that at the time, 1 in 4 births in the United States, 1 in 4 pregnant women delivered via C-section in that year, which as Project Censored characterized it, is an epidemic of C-sections. Now, nobody is saying that that cesarean sections are not necessary in certain cases. Sometimes they're necessary to save the life of the mother. Sometimes they're necessary because the fetus is exhibiting extreme distress. There are absolutely occasions when C-sections are necessary, but every kind of medical association that has looked at this, every doctor's group that has looked at this, has said that's an outrageously high number. As the original report noted, that high number of cesarean deliveries in the U.S. back in the mid 90s may have been related to finances, may have been related to health insurance. So, for example, there was a study that found that for-profit hospitals had a much higher rate of cesarean deliveries.
Surprise, Steve, doctors have to schedule golf outings. They can't wait for natural births.
Yeah, than public for-profits. They also, there was a speculation in the report that maybe doctors were delivering more by C-section out of fear of being hit by malpractice lawsuits. There was another study that found that women who delivered later in the day, when there are fewer doctors on call, were more likely to deliver back in the mid 90s by C-section. Now, I'm happy to report that this is one issue about which there has been, since it was originally flagged by Project Censored, growing public concern. Medical associations, states, and even the federal government have created standards that encourage appropriate use of C-sections, but really try to encourage pregnant women to deliver vaginally, to have natural births. One of the big changes that's taken place is back in the mid 90s. It was common wisdom in the OBGYN community to if a woman had delivered by C-section, to encourage her to deliver her subsequent pregnancies via C-section. Now, it is common practice to have women deliver vaginally who have had C-sections. But one of the things that is alarming is while C-sections have sort of plateaued and somewhat declined here in the U.S., thanks to these growing awareness, and especially in the medical community, that we had too many C-sections back in the 90s. Internationally, the number of C-sections continue to climb. Mm-hmm. So it is now close to 20% internationally, which is getting back to that epidemic number.
Well, Steve Macek, that's related to, we've covered issues around midwifery at the project for a long time, including going all the way back over 10 years with Ina May Gaskin. There's been an attack on midwives, on natural births, as being something that's outside the corporate medical establishment that's been very problematic. There have been laws passed to try to limit the kinds of care that midwives can offer. And again, midwifery has long argued about natural birth. And so it's interesting to see that some in the corporate medical establishment are catching up to what many midwives have known for ages and ages. So in fact, our co-host Eleanor Goldfield actually just did a segment not long ago with a midwife discussing some of these issues. And, unfortunately, we are running out of time. We could just keep talking. You all have done amazing work, and you always have so much to offer. Shealeigh, Voitl, we wanted to come back over to you to wrap up the segment. You all co-authored this work, Deja Vu News, for Project Censored, along with Mac Palator and also Isa Chudzik. You two both worked with them putting this together. So Shealeigh, let's give you the final word here. Just a conclusion about the work that you've done, the importance of the Deja Vu work, and how, what are some lessons maybe that you've taken from this and you think that people should be mindful of?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, like you said, this is my second time contributing to the Deja Vu chapter. And I think this is particularly special, this one, because they all share this common theme. We've talked about it, corporate power interfering and disrupting parts of human biological life. But I think these stories, all of them, and all of the Deja Vu chapters, have planted little seeds in my brain. I think it's interesting to continuously follow up with these stories. I mean, there was one in last year's about 8 Can't Wait. And I think, those particular stories are always evolving. And so, even when you don't see it in the corporate media, it's still important to kind of follow up and to wonder and to be curious about these things, because they are affecting us in different ways all the time, especially these stories, these environmental related stories. It's something that, is not maybe consistently talked about in the corporate media, but something that readers maybe will be reminded to follow up on their own as well in the years to come.
I think too, the historical context is important, and the corporate media miss many of these stories and continue to. So imagine, just rank and file citizens, common folks, if these major media outlets that people rely on don't report on them, it's like the tree that falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it. Doesn't make a sound. Well, the Deja Vu chapter reminds us that it does make a sound and it does have impact. And it's often the independent press that hears it and then tries to amplify it so others can have can learn about these kind of things, because these challenges are long standing in the making. Oftentimes the things that we see in the headlines didn't just happen today or yesterday. There's a long history to them. And that's why I think that the utility of the Deja Vu research, I think, is fascinating and significant. So thanks so much for doing it. And thanks for joining us on the show today, Shealeigh.
Thank you so much, Mickey.
Steve Macek, final words from you.
Oh, Mickey, yeah, I would just second everything Shealeigh was saying there about the importance of this chapter. It's important also because in this chapter, we sometimes give credit to corporate media when they do pick up on important stories, right? That, that first were covered by the independent and alternative press, but they finally do make their way into the national news agenda, and become part of public discourse. So I think it's important to acknowledge when that happens. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen all that often.
Not enough.
So.
Well, Steve Macek, Shealeigh Voitl, thank you so much for joining us on the Project Censored show. We've been talking about Deja Vu news, eating and drinking, birthing and breastfeeding. I'll look back at the establishment media's failure to report corporate interference with basic human biology. Steve and Shealeigh, thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to having you back on the program in the future.
Thanks Mickey.
So much.
I'm Mickey Huff. You're listening to the Project Censored show. We'll continue our program after this brief musical break. Stay with us.